Hello, you've decided to click on this video, so you must want to know about submarines. And I'm a A-level history person, and I have too much spare time, so I'm making this. So, I hope you enjoy it. And even if you don't, I don't... Oh, well, I guess I do care, because then you won't watch it. Actually, no, you've already watched it if you know you don't care, so ha! I've got you. Oh, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, submarines, let's talk about. Okay, now the fanfare's over, we can actually start talking about this. It was submarines we were talking about, wasn't it? That was it, yeah. Okay, so to start with submarines, you'd think we'd have to go back to World War One. Well, you're wrong. We've got to go much further back. And not Victorian era, we've got to go back to Alexander the Great. Because, of course, that's the sanest place to start with anything to do with submarines. And when I realised that, yeah, this is probably a cool place to start, I then realised this is probably going to have to be multiple videos. Because, Alexander the Great was a really long time ago. Anyway, so let's start this. Alexander the Great is claimed to have descended into the sea during a siege in 332 BC, at the siege of... I want to say that's pronounced Tyre, but I'm almost certainly sure it's not. However, this is also from the bit of history which is where everything is... This might be mythical. So, yeah, we really don't know. He probably just sent down divers, but Aristotle said he was in a submarine. And it's also a weird story, so I'm going to talk about that. Okay, so it's said that Alexander the Great went down a great glass diving bell, essentially, what we'd consider... not what we consider a modern submarine, with a dog, a cat, and a rooster. Yeah, this isn't going to be normal for a bit. So, at this point, as far as from what I know, which is very little about this because it's weird, the dog, I can't remember what the dog was meant to do. The cat, they thought cats breathe like plants do, as in they breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, keep an atmosphere fresh. Of course, they didn't really know what that is, and that might be completely wrong. And the cockerel had something to do with navigation, I think. This is the story I've heard. Essentially, I think there's also then a story that it sunk and he couldn't get back up, so he killed the animals or whatever. I don't know. It's a weird story, and it's also probably mythical because it sounds stupid. And if this actually happened, the world would be a lot more whimsical. Okay, now skipping ahead a bit to the only other notable mention, because most of the history of submarines is just people creating things that are essentially just as barrels that you float around in. We go to a Dutchman with a name I'm not going to try to pronounce because I'll probably offend Dutch people, because I cannot trust myself to pronounce anything in Dutch because it looks so stupid in English. But there's a guy called Drebel, along with a guy called John Napier, and I believe a guy called Henry Briggs, build this submarine in the 1600s. And they had some minor success, sort of floating it around on the Thames. I have a photo of it on the screen at the moment, and yeah, well, a reproduction of it on the screen. And it's essentially a big barrel with oars. But it was a popular thing to see because it was cool and it was a novelty. I mean, even King James I went in it, which is profoundly weird to think about. The first royal to go in a submarine was King James I of England, as in King James I of the English Civil War, which most people probably don't know about because it's a very weird bit of history which is bordering on Balkan levels of confusing. Anyway, moving on to another thing which some people call the first submarine, but almost certainly isn't, but something I just find weird, is an American design from the Revolutionary War called the Turtle. Now, the Turtle is weird. It's essentially, the photo on screen, you've got the man sits in it, sort of under the water, and I believe he turns a handle to make it move, or pedals it. It's not very clear from the diagram. And then he'd go under a British a ship blockading the port. I believe it was for the port of Boston, and would drill a hole in the bottom of it using that little drill thing on the top. This didn't work. Of course, this didn't work. It's ridiculous. It didn't work. But a lot of Americans will claim this is the first submarine. And a lot of other Americans claim something else is the first submarine. However, these Americans usually some of them are just normal people with interest in the Civil War, and some of them have interesting political beliefs. But anyway, not going into politics. The CSS Hunley, I believe it was called, and I've now lost the thing I was meant to be looking out for it, was a early submarine, and it's generally considered the first submarine. It shouldn't be considered the first submarine because it was rubbish, but it's sort of considered the first submarine. Anyway, so the idea of the Hunley is it's a death trap. Everyone in the crew turns a crankshaft that drives the propeller, except the captain, who's navigating it, and then its armament, you're probably thinking it's probably something quite advanced, maybe it's some sort of submersible cannon or something. No, it is a bomb on a stick. This is an early form of torpedo, which I can't remember the name of, but it's weird, and it's not overly worth talking about because it's just too weird and I don't want to. So there. Think that way you want, Americans. Ha. But okay, briefly talking about this, it is also sort of the first successful submarine attack, as it did take out a US ship which was called the... oh my god, the names of American ships. The Housatonic? I don't know how to say that. But the USS Housatonic, let's just go with that because I definitely got that wrong. After 2 failed attempts where the submarine just sunk and killed everyone on board, including its inventor, it did eventually manage to blow a hole in the bottom of the Housatonic and sink it. But it also sunk itself in the process. So yeah, take that how you will. Okay, now on to actual not modern submarines, but early submarines, instead of just strange things that people dreamt up in times where just truly Wallace and Gromit inventions, honestly. But so now we're on to 2 submarines, one of which is incredibly well known and one of which is not. Starting with the incredibly well known one, the Holland 1. Now, the story of this is there was an Irish guy who invented a submarine using a diesel engine and batteries, who went to the Royal Navy and went, "Look at this, it's excellent." And they went, "No, it's ridiculous." And the Admiralty then continued to sustain that view up until about the start of World War One. And he then went away and went, "Well, if that's not going to work, I'm going to go and sell it to the Americans." So he did. And it became the Holland, after him, because his name was Holland. Which, you ask me, is a weird name. But Holland then, having got money from the Americans to build these things, starts a company called Electric Boat. And eventually the Royal Navy take notice and realise, even the Royal Navy, who hated submarines because, we've got battleships, we've got more battleships than anybody else on the planet, they eventually realised that maybe they should have at least some understanding of how submarines work, because we really had no idea about them. So we actually got a few Hollands built in Bowen-Furness, which to this day still builds all the Royal Navy submarines. Although, now I'm going on a tangent, because a lot of people say this is the first submarine built in the UK, which it isn't. First submarine built in the UK was an Ottoman submarine called the... the Abdul Hamid, I think that's how that's pronounced, although I'm almost certainly wrong. which was a steam-powered submarine built for the Ottoman Navy in the 1880s, which actually fired torpedoes. And these have a semi-interesting history, because they were the first ones built at Barrow Shipyard, which still builds the Royal Navy submarines. That's vaguely interesting. But they never saw action, although they were considered to be used for port defence during the First World War by the German naval advisors, who were sort of trying to make the Ottoman Navy into a fighting force, not a museum at sea, for port defence. And then they actually looked at them and realised how much rust was on the hull and decided against it. They were also designed by a guy called Thorsten Nordfeld, who, there's nothing particular about him. He just has a mental beard, and moustache, and has a cool name. So I thought I'd bring him up. Okay, but now on to the other submarine I was meant to be talking about before I went on this weird tangent. That has the honour of going to a French submarine that barely anyone's heard of, called the Narwhal, or Narval, or however the French say Narwhal, which was designed by another man with an equally excellent beard, which invented a concept that is also still used in submarines today, when he invented a steam-powered submarine, the Narval. I already said that. Okay. Which had one very important detail, which was that it could actually sail. As submarines before, it had one major problem, which is they were good at going underwater for short periods of time, but, not the rest of it. Like manoeuvring, or patrolling, or going into large seas, like the Atlantic, or the Pacific, or the Mediterranean, or really anywhere where a naval conflict might happen. But he had this excellent idea, I can't remember his name, but he had an excellent moustache, of building... I'll put a picture of him on the screen if I can remember what his name is, or if I can find a picture of him, of building a submarine with two hulls, which sounds weird. It is. Because the idea was that it would have one inner hull, which was pressurised, and that's where everyone lives, and, fights and does all the cool submariner stuff. I don't know what goes on in French submarines. I'm British, why did I know? But then there's an outer hull, which is shaped like a boat's, so it can actually sail instead of just sort of bobbing about in a harbour to impress tourists. And it works. And it actually works, which is the weirdest bit of it. Because, nobody actually expected that to happen. Because, submarines are a bit of a novelty at this point. But anyway. So now I have a French man with an excellent moustache who's designed a submarine which can actually sail, and an Irish man whose moustache state I cannot remember, who's designed a submarine that's actually practical and doesn't rely on steam engines. Because before this, submarines used steam engines, and I still am completely baffled about how steam-powered submarines work. I'm very interested in submarines, but it's still bizarre. It's still bizarre to me. But eventually, these two ideas would meet, because as most people, at least in Britain, learnt in history class, a Serbian man shot an Austrian man in Bosnia, and that means war. Which is a very simplistic way of explaining how World War One starts. But that means that the Germans, who have a fleet of warships, they actually have one of the best fleets of warships, are now fighting, and they very quickly realise that the Royal Navy is still better than them. So, which I actually want to do an entire other video on World War One, this whole naval side of World War One, because it's not shown enough. because it's a complete opposite to the depressingness of the land war, because it is just utterly bizarre. Utterly bizarre ideas were had. And one of these ideas that turned out to be weird but actually work was U-19. And there is a photo of U-19 on the screen at the moment. I'm not sure if this is the correct U-19 though, because the Germans can't name submarines. This is their one downside. Everything's just U and then a number. So there's been several U-19s. I think this is the right one. We're going to go with it. It's the right one. We're saying it's the right one. Okay, so U-19 combines the diesel-electric system out of the Holland 1 with the Narwhal's cool double-hull design, which outraged the French because now a design they'd built was going against them, and outraged the Royal Navy because of slightly more complicated reasons, which I don't fully, well, I actually sort of understand them, but they are just weird, called the cruiser rules, which that's a story for another time. But yeah. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here with this part of it, which was a brief run through of the submarines from Alexander the Great to the Germans. And I think I've covered most of the more interesting bits of it, by which I mean the weirder bits of it, because, that's really what you're interested in. We want to know about the specification of diesel engines. Go and watch a proper historian. Go and watch Subbrief or Lindy Beige or Mark Felton, who actually do proper research and understand history. I mean, why are you watching this? I'm just ranting about submarines. Okay, have fun. If you like this, watch part 2, which is coming possibly maybe in the future at some point, where I'll talk about why the Germans had submarines and why they were so annoying, why the Americans eventually decided that Germans having submarines was cause to send their country into the most brutal war or at that point in human history, and why the Royal Navy ended up shooting, and why the Germans and the Royal Navy ended up fighting two ocean liners that were identically painted and had torpedo boat guns mounted to them. Yeah, history's weird at some times. Oh yeah, and also World War II, we'll cover that. Okay, bye.